Some dogs stop barking when they lose hope. This one stopped looking at people altogether. The rain had been falling over Bendigo since late afternoon, soft at first, then harder as the evening rolled across the old country roads like a gray tide. Water streamed down rusted gutters and gathered in shallow puddles beside the shelter fence where weeds bent low beneath the wind. Inside the small rescue center on the edge of town, fluorescent lights hummed weakly overhead, casting pale reflections across rows of steel kennels that smelled faintly of wet fur, antiseptic, and old timber swollen from years of storms. Most of the dogs barked whenever footsteps passed. Some scratched at the gates. Some jumped with desperate hope each time a visitor entered. But not the shepherd in the far corner. He lay curled against the back wall of the last kennel near the storage room, half hidden in shadow where the light barely reached. His coat had once been beautiful. You could still see it beneath the neglect. Dark sable fur streaked with silver around the muzzle, thick shoulders now thinner than they should have been, one ear bent slightly where an old injury had healed wrong. A faded blue blanket sat untouched beside him. So did the stainless steel food bowl. The handwritten card clipped outside the kennel read only one word. Rook. Underneath, in smaller letters written by tired hands, does not respond well to contact. 43 days. That was how long the shelter staff said the dog had gone without truly looking at anyone. He ate only when left alone. Slept facing the wall. Never growled. Never wagged his tail. Just breathed quietly as though surviving had become a habit instead of a choice. Poor old blokes, already gone. One volunteer whispered as she stacked towels near reception. Body just hasn't caught up yet. Outside, thunder rolled low across the hills. The automatic door rattled in the wind before finally sliding open again with a tired mechanical groan. A man stepped inside carrying the cold with him. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a dark oilskin jacket damp from rain. Early signs of gray near the temples. Mud on his boots from the highway. He paused near the entrance as water dripped from his sleeves onto the concrete floor. Ethan Calloway had not planned to stop there. He had been driving north for nearly 6 hours after leaving Melbourne before dawn, trying to outrun another sleepless week and the silence waiting for him back at the lake cabin. The storm had simply forced him off the road. That was all. At least that was what he told himself. The woman behind the desk offered him a polite smile. Road's shocking tonight. You all right there, mate? Ethan nodded once. Just waiting out the rain. His voice carried the roughness of someone who didn't use it much anymore. He removed one glove slowly, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. As he did, the sleeve of his jacket shifted slightly, revealing the faded black ink wrapped around his right forearm. The tattoo showed the face of a German shepherd. Alert ears. Intelligent eyes. A military K9 portrait weathered by time and sun. The volunteer noticed it immediately. You had a shepherd? She asked gently. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Once. The room fell quiet again except for rain tapping the windows and the distant clatter of kennel gates further down the hall. Then something unusual happened. In the very last kennel near the storage room, Rook lifted his head. Not quickly. Slowly. Like a creature waking from somewhere far away. One amber eye opened fully. Then the other. The shepherd stared down the corridor toward the front desk, ears twitching faintly at the sound of Ethan's voice. A young kennel worker blinked in surprise. Hang on, he muttered under his breath. That dog hasn't reacted to anyone in weeks. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was staring absently through the rain-streaked window beside reception, somewhere lost inside his own thoughts. But down the corridor, Rook rose unsteadily onto all fours. The metal tag hanging from his kennel door rattled softly as he stepped forward out of the shadows for the first time in days. And then, for the first time in 43 silent nights, the dog looked directly at a human being like he still remembered what hope felt like. The shelter worker watched in stunned silence as Rook remained standing. At the front of the kennel, amber eyes fixed on Ethan like something buried deep inside the old shepherd had suddenly stirred awake. The rain hammered harder against the roof now, filling the building with a steady hollow drumming that mixed with the distant barking of the other dogs. Yet through all of it, Rook never looked away. Ethan noticed the stare only after a few long seconds. He turned slightly toward the corridor, brows narrowing beneath tired eyes. The shepherd stood perfectly still beneath the pale fluorescent light, ribs faintly visible beneath his dark coat, one paw slightly lifted as though unsure whether to step closer or retreat again into the safety of shadow. Something tightened in Ethan's chest before he could stop it. Not fear. Something older than that. Recognition. That him, he asked quietly. The young kennel worker nodded. Yeah, that is Rook. He glanced toward the dog with visible confusion. Strange though. Usually he hides soon as anyone comes near. Ethan slipped his glove back on slowly. How long has he been here? Nearly 2 months. The worker leaned against the counter. Council found him wandering near Castlemaine after those floods in autumn. No readable chip. No owner came forward. He hesitated. Bloke barely reacts to people anymore. Vet reckons stress shut him down. Ethan gave a faint nod, but said nothing. Outside, headlights smeared gold across the wet windows as another car passed along the highway. The storm carried the smell of soaked eucalyptus through the cracks near the entrance door. Somewhere deeper in the shelter, a kettle clicked on. Ordinary sounds. Quiet sounds. But beneath them all sat the strange weight of the dog's stare. Ethan finally stepped toward the kennel corridor. The volunteer beside reception straightened immediately. Careful, mate. He does not like strangers too close. Ethan kept walking anyway. His boots echoed softly against the concrete floor while rows of restless dogs shifted and barked behind steel gates. Some jumped for attention. Others whimpered. Rook did neither. He simply watched Ethan approach with an intensity that felt almost human. The closer Ethan came, the more details emerged from the dim light. Old scars hidden beneath the fur near the shepherd's shoulder. Mud stains around his paws. Gray beginning to frost the muzzle long before age should have placed it there. A tiredness in the eyes Ethan recognized far too well. He stopped about 2 meters from the kennel. Rook lowered his head slightly, but did not retreat. Hello, mate, Ethan murmured. The words came rough and unfamiliar from disuse. The shepherd's ears twitched faintly at the sound. Behind Ethan, the kennel worker crossed his arms. That is the closest he has stayed to anyone. Ethan crouched slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. Rainwater dripped from the hem of his jacket onto the floor. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved at all. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Wind rattled the shelter roof. Then Ethan noticed something hanging beneath the shepherd's neck, half buried in fur. An old leather collar, worn nearly white with age. Thought you said no owner, Ethan said softly. No current registered owner, the worker replied. The collar was already on him. No tag, though, and the chip scanner only picked up damaged fragments. Ethan stared at the cracked leather strap, while a strange heaviness settled over him. Atlas had worn a collar just like that. Same dark stitching. Same weathered edges softened by years of loyal service. The memory arrived before he could stop it. Dusty heat. Afghan mountains. Rotor blades chopping through dry air. Atlas trotting beside him beneath a pale sunrise. Ears sharp. Tail steady. Trusting him completely. Ethan swallowed hard. He had spent 3 years trying not to remember those eyes. 3 years avoiding kennels, parks, even the sound of tags clinking outside cafes. Some losses did not leave cleanly. They stayed in the bones like winter damp. Rook shifted closer to the kennel gate. One careful step, then another. Ethan froze instinctively. The shepherd lowered his nose toward the bars near Ethan's hand. Not aggressive, not fearful, just cautious. Searching. The worker blinked in disbelief. You are kidding me. Ethan remained perfectly still while Rook sniffed the air around him. The dog's breathing sounded shallow, but calm. Then his nose brushed softly against Ethan's knuckles. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough. The shepherd flinched almost immediately afterward, as though startled by his own courage, and backed away 2 small steps into shadow again. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. He has been hurt before. Yeah, the worker muttered quietly. We think so too. Silence settled between them again. The storm outside rolled lower now, thunder vibrating faintly through the windows. Ethan remained crouched near the kennel longer than he intended. Long enough for his knees to ache. Long enough for the volunteer to disappear briefly and return carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Ethan carefully. You know dogs? She asked. Ethan stared into the steam rising from the cup. Used to. Military. He nodded once. Army. Dog handler. Her eyes softened immediately with understanding Australians rarely needed words for. That explains the tattoo. Ethan glanced down unconsciously at the shepherd inked across his forearm before looking back toward Rook. The dog had not taken his eyes off him once. Funny thing about this bloke, she said quietly. Some nights, he sits awake facing the front door till sunrise. Like he is waiting for somebody who never came back. Ethan felt that sentence settle heavily inside him, because he knew exactly what that kind of waiting felt like. The rain eased slightly near midnight. Water still dripped from the gutters outside, but the worst of the storm had passed east toward the ranges. Ethan stood slowly, finishing the last cold mouthful of tea. Road should clear soon, the worker said. You heading back tonight? Ethan looked at the dog one last time. Rook had lowered himself onto the blanket again, but unlike before, he no longer faced the wall. His eyes stayed fixed on Ethan beneath the dim shelter lights, alert despite exhaustion, as though terrified the stranger might disappear the moment he looked away. Something about that look lingered deep beneath Ethan's ribs. Something unfinished. He reached into his jacket pocket for his keys, then stopped halfway. Outside, thunder faded into the distance. Inside the kennel, the old shepherd quietly rested his head against the cold steel gate and kept watching him like a soul standing alone at the edge of the world, hoping this time somebody might finally stay. The highway outside Bendigo shimmered beneath the fading rain as Ethan finally stepped out of the shelter just after midnight, the cold air carrying the earthy scent of soaked gum trees and wet gravel. The storm clouds had begun to break apart above the hills, revealing thin slices of moonlight that silvered the puddles across the empty car park. He stood beside his dusty Land Cruiser for a long moment without opening the door. Behind him, through the shelter window fogged by warmth and rain, he could still see the faint outline of Rook lying near the kennel gate, instead of hidden against the wall. Watching. Waiting. Ethan looked away first. His fingers tightened around the car keys. He had spent years learning how to leave before attachment could root itself too deeply again. That lesson had cost him enough already. The engine coughed awake with a low diesel rumble, headlights washing pale gold across the fence line as he pulled back onto the highway. Tires hissed softly over wet bitumen, while Bendigo disappeared behind him kilometer by kilometer. The radio stayed off. It always stayed off these days. Silence felt easier than thoughts. But sometime around 1 a.m, somewhere between dark paddocks and flooded roadside drains, Ethan realized he could still see the shepherd's eyes every time he blinked. Not pleading, not frightened, just tired in the same way he was tired. The lake cabin sat nearly 70 kilometers north of town, hidden beyond a narrow dirt track lined with peppermint gums and tall yellow grass flattened by rain. The place had belonged to Ethan's grandfather once. Small weatherboard walls, rusted tin roof, a sagging veranda facing black water that stayed perfectly still most mornings. Quiet enough for a man trying to disappear from the world. He parked beneath the leaning carport and killed the engine. Instantly the night swallowed everything. No traffic, no neighbors, only distant frogs calling somewhere near the reeds and the soft creak of wet branches moving in the wind. Ethan remained seated behind the wheel for a while, staring at the cabin lights glowing dimly through the rain-specked windscreen. Then his eyes drifted toward the passenger seat without thinking. Empty. He swallowed hard. Atlas used to ride there after patrols overseas. Head resting near the window, ears twitching at every strange sound. Sometimes Ethan still caught himself reaching across instinctively, as though the dog might still be there beside him after all these years. Grief did strange things to memory. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke, dust, and old coffee grounds. Ethan shrugged off his jacket near the door and tossed the keys onto the kitchen bench. The house felt colder than usual tonight despite the storm passing. He moved quietly through familiar routines. Kettle on. Boots off. One lamp lit near the lounge. Shadows shifted softly across the timber walls where framed photographs hung half-forgotten beneath years of silence. Most were old military shots. Desert landscapes. Smiling young soldiers trying to look tougher than they felt. One photograph sat apart from the others above the fireplace. Ethan in uniform kneeling beside a dark-coated German shepherd with alert ears and bright, intelligent eyes. Atlas. Beneath the frame rested the folded collar Ethan had never managed to throw away. He avoided looking at it most nights. Tonight he could not stop. Steam curled upward from the kettle while rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters outside. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face slowly, exhaustion settling heavier into his shoulders now that the long drive was over. But sleep already felt impossible. It usually did. Around 3 in the morning, he finally lay down on the old couch near the fireplace instead of the bedroom upstairs. Storm nights made the nightmares worse somehow. The wind changed direction near dawn, rattling the windows hard enough to wake him from a shallow, restless sleep filled with fragmented memories and distant rotor blades. Ethan sat upright immediately, chest tight, breathing uneven. For one disorienting moment, he thought he heard claws scratching softly at the cabin door. He stared into the dark silence. Nothing, just branches moving outside. Yet his pulse refused to settle. He stood and crossed toward the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter while trying to steady himself. The familiar pressure tightened slowly behind his ribs again, the kind that arrived without warning some nights. Heavy, suffocating, like the walls themselves were shrinking inward. Ethan shut his eyes hard. Breathe in, breathe out. The therapist in Melbourne had taught him that years ago. Most nights it barely helped. His gaze drifted unconsciously toward the empty floor beside the couch, where Atlas once slept during storms. The absence there felt enormous suddenly. Outside, dawn crept slowly over the lake in pale silver bands. Mist floated low across the water while magpies began calling somewhere beyond the trees. Ethan had not realized he was still standing motionless in the kitchen until the sound of tires crunching softly outside reached him. He frowned slightly and moved toward the window. A white utility vehicle from the shelter rolled slowly into the driveway, headlights cutting through the morning fog. The young kennel worker stepped out wearing a rain jacket and work boots splashed with mud. Ethan opened the front door before the man even reached the veranda. "Everything all right?" he asked. The worker removed his cap awkwardly. "Sorry to bother you this early, mate." He hesitated. "It is the shepherd." Ethan's stomach tightened instantly despite himself. "What happened?" "Nothing bad." The worker glanced back toward the vehicle. "Well, not exactly." Ethan followed his gaze. Inside the back crate of the shelter Uda, barely visible through the wire partition, sat Rook, completely still, watching the cabin with quiet amber eyes. "I rang the number you left on the visitor's sheet," the worker explained softly. "Couldn't get through. He would not settle after you left. Would not eat. Kept pacing the kennel door all night." He swallowed, suddenly embarrassed. "The manager approved an emergency foster trial only because you signed the K9 experience form before leaving. I brought the paperwork. If you say no, he goes straight back with me." Ethan stared at the shepherd in stunned silence while cool dawn wind stirred across the veranda. Rook did not bark, did not move. He simply held Ethan's gaze through the wire crate with the same quiet expression from the shelter, as though something deep inside him had already made a decision neither of them fully understood yet. The cold morning air drifted quietly across the lake as Ethan stood motionless on the veranda, staring at the shepherd inside the wire crate of the shelter Uda. Thin ribbons of fog still floated over the water behind him, pale and ghost-like beneath the soft gray dawn. Somewhere in the trees, a kookaburra called once before the bush fell silent again. Rook remained perfectly still in the back of the vehicle. No barking, no scratching at the crate door. Just those steady amber eyes fixed on Ethan as though the dog had traveled all this way for only one reason. The young shelter worker rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I know it sounds strange," he admitted quietly, "but soon as I said your name, mate," he stopped pacing. Ethan did not answer immediately. His gaze stayed locked on the shepherd, while something uneasy shifted beneath his ribs. The sensible part of him already knew this was a bad idea. Dogs needed stability, routine, families, not an isolated former Marine living alone beside a forgotten lake carrying enough sleepless nights to drown in. Yet the sight of Rook sitting there so calmly in the dawn light chipped at something Ethan had spent years trying to harden shut. "You drove all this way before breakfast for a dog who barely knows me?" he finally asked. "Because he chose your voice before he chose anyone's hand," the worker replied. He gave a small, uncertain shrug and lifted the folder under his arm. "Look, if you want me to take him back, I will. The trial only starts if you sign. I just figured, maybe he chose something for himself for once." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Chose. Funny word." He glanced toward the old collar hanging around Rook's neck. Weathered leather. Cracked edges. Still holding together despite years of wear. Somehow that felt familiar too. The shelter worker stepped toward the crate carefully and unlatched the rear door. "Easy boy." Rook did not rush out. He remained inside a few seconds longer, studying Ethan with quiet caution before finally stepping down onto the gravel driveway. His movements carried the stiffness of an older dog trying not to show pain. Wet earth crunched softly beneath large paws as he paused near the Uda. The morning breeze stirred through the dark fur along his shoulders. Ethan noticed scars more clearly now beneath the sable coat. Old ones, healed long ago, not fresh wounds. The kind life leaves behind silently. Rook lifted his nose slightly, scenting the unfamiliar air around the cabin. Lake water, damp timber, smoke lingering faintly from the fireplace. Then his eyes drifted back to Ethan again. Always back to Ethan. You can keep him for the day if you want, the worker offered gently. No pressure. Just see how he settles. Ethan crossed his arms against the cold. And if he does not, then I come back this arvo and pick him up. Silence settled over the driveway. Somewhere beyond the reeds, water lapped softly against the muddy shoreline. Rook took one cautious step toward the veranda. Then another. Ethan stayed still. The shepherd stopped barely a meter away, head lowered slightly as though waiting for permission that had never come easily in his life. Up close, Ethan could see the exhaustion in him even clearer now. Not just physical fatigue, soul-deep weariness, the kind that comes after too many departures. Ethan recognized it because he carried the same thing in his own eyes each morning. All right, he muttered at last, more to himself than anyone else. One day, relief crossed the shelter worker's face instantly. Good on you, mate. Ethan frowned faintly. Do not make a big thing out of it. But the truth was already sitting quietly between man and dog before either of them admitted it aloud. The worker left shortly afterward, tires crunching slowly down the dirt track until the sound disappeared into the trees. Then there were only two living souls left beside the lake again. Ethan remained on the veranda while Rook stood below near the steps, uncertain what came next. The shepherd glanced toward the open cabin door, but did not enter. Ethan noticed immediately. You waiting for an invitation? He asked quietly. Rook's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. For the first time in years, the corner of Ethan's mouth almost moved toward a smile. Almost. He stepped aside from the doorway. Come on then. The shepherd hesitated before climbing the wooden steps slowly, claws tapping softly against old timber boards weathered pale by decades of sun and rain. Inside, the cabin remained dim and cool despite the growing daylight outside. Rook paused near the entrance immediately, scanning every corner with careful eyes. Not fearful, just alert. Ethan recognized the behavior instantly. Military working dogs always mapped exits first. Old instincts stayed buried deep. The shepherd moved quietly through the lounge room, nose drifting near furniture and walls as though reading traces of memory hidden in scent. When he reached the fireplace, he stopped. Ethan froze behind him. Above the mantel sat the framed photograph of Atlas. Young Ethan kneeling beside his old K9 partner beneath a blazing desert sunrise years earlier. Rook stared at the picture for several long seconds. Then slowly, almost reverently, he lowered himself onto the rug beneath it. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. You have got to be kidding me, he whispered under his breath. The cabin fell silent except for the faint hiss of the kettle beginning to warm again in the kitchen. Sunlight crept gradually through the windows now, turning drifting dust into pale gold streaks across the room. Rook rested his head between his paws without taking his eyes off Ethan. Calm, watchful, like he had already decided this place mattered somehow. Ethan busied himself making tea simply to avoid thinking too hard about any of it. He filled a bowl with fresh water and set it near the kitchen table. Rook approached only after Ethan stepped back. The shepherd drank slowly, cautiously, as though still expecting the kindness to disappear if he trusted it too quickly. Ethan leaned against the counter quietly watching him. You know, he murmured after a while, I was not planning on company. Rook glanced up briefly, at the sound of his voice before lowering his muzzle to the water again. The simple movement carried something strangely human inside it. Weariness, gratitude, caution. Ethan looked away toward the rain-specked windows overlooking the lake. The world outside remained washed clean and silver beneath the fading storm clouds. Somewhere deep inside the cabin, an old ache shifted slightly for the first time in years. Not healed, not gone, just quieter. By late morning, sunlight finally broke fully through the clouds, spilling warm gold across the veranda and lake reeds swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan sat outside with untouched tea cooling between his hands while Rook lay near the steps facing the water. Neither made much sound. They did not need to. Some broken things recognized each other long before words ever could. The afternoon passed slowly beside the lake, wrapped in the kind of silence that did not feel empty anymore. Sunlight filtered through tall gums surrounding the cabin, turning the damp earth gold, while cicadas hummed faintly somewhere beyond the reeds. Ethan remained seated on the veranda steps with a mug of tea, cooling forgotten, between his hands. Rook lay several feet away facing the water, alert ears twitching now and then whenever wind moved through the grass. Neither tried forcing closeness. That was what made it different. There was no desperate neediness in the shepherd. No jumping. No barking for affection. Just a quiet presence that settled beside Ethan like it had always belonged there. Around midday, clouds finally cleared fully from the sky, revealing pale blue stretched wide above the lake country. Ethan stood stiffly and rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "You hungry, mate?" Rook lifted his head immediately at the sound of his voice. Ethan noticed that too. The dog responded not to movement, but to tone. Familiar. Trained. Inside the cabin, Ethan rummaged through cupboards until he found an old tin bowl left over from years ago. His hands paused briefly while washing it beneath the sink. Atlas used to eat from this same bowl after training runs along the shoreline. The memory arrived softer this time. Less like a knife. More like an ache carried too long. He filled the bowl carefully and placed it near the kitchen doorway before stepping back to give the shepherd space. Rook approached cautiously, nose testing the air first before lowering himself to eat. Not rushed. Measured. Like a dog who had learned food could disappear without warning if he trusted comfort too quickly. Ethan leaned against the counter quietly watching him. "You do everything carefully, do you not?" The shepherd glanced up briefly before returning to the bowl. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window across his sable coat, revealing silver hairs woven deep near the shoulders and scars Ethan had not fully noticed before. One old mark ran beneath the fur near the ribcage. Another near the front leg. Not signs of cruelty. Signs of survival. That afternoon, Ethan tried reading for a while beside the fireplace, but his attention kept drifting toward the shepherd resting on the rug below Atlas's photograph. Rook had not wandered far from that spot all day. Occasionally, his eyes followed Ethan around the room, calm but watchful, as though making certain the man was still there. Around 3 o'clock, Ethan finally gave up pretending to focus on the book. "You are staring at me again." Rook blinked once slowly but did not move. Ethan exhaled through his nose, almost amused despite himself. "You know that is rude, yeah?" For the briefest second, the shepherd's tail thumped softly against the rug. Just once. Ethan froze. The sound felt strangely loud inside the quiet cabin. Rook seemed startled by it too because the tail stopped immediately afterward. But Ethan had already seen it. A tiny crack in the silence. A living thing beneath all that grief. Something warm shifted painfully inside Ethan's chest. He looked away toward the lake before the feeling settled too deeply. By evening, the wind turned cooler again, carrying the smell of rain somewhere far off beyond the hills. Ethan lit the fireplace as shadows stretched across the timber floorboards. Flames flickered softly against the walls while darkness gathered outside the windows. Rook remained near the hearth watching the fire with calm amber eyes. "Storm again. Tonight," Ethan murmured while tossing another log into the flames. "You all right with thunder?" At the sound of the word thunder, the shepherd's ears flattened almost imperceptibly. Ethan noticed immediately. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me neither." Dinner was simple. Toast. Soup heated from a tin. The kind of meal Ethan usually ate standing at the kitchen bench without thinking much about it. But tonight another breathing presence existed inside the cabin. Another heartbeat. Strange how quickly loneliness noticed when it was no longer alone. Later that night, rain finally returned, soft at first against the tin roof before gradually strengthening into a steady rhythm that filled every corner of the house. Ethan sat near the fireplace with an old wool blanket over his knees while Rook remained curled nearby on the rug. The shepherd had still not approached close enough to touch. Somehow that restraint mattered. Trust offered carefully always meant more than affection thrown blindly at anyone willing to take it. Around 10 o'clock the power flickered once. Then again. The cabin dimmed suddenly before settling into darkness, except for the firelight glowing warm across the room. Ethan sighed softly. Of course. He reached for the torch resting beneath the side table, but before he could stand, thunder cracked sharply over the lake. The sound rolled deep through the walls. Instantly, Rook rose onto all fours. Not barking, not panicking, just suddenly alert in a way that transformed him from weary shelter dog into something focused and intensely aware. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly at the thunder. His breathing shortened before he could stop it. Another flash lit the windows white. Rotor blades, dust storms, radio static. Memories arrived hard and fast like they always did during storms. Ethan stood abruptly and crossed toward the kitchen sink, gripping the edge tightly while trying to steady himself. Breathe. Just breathe. Rain hammered the roof harder now. Another thunderclap rolled overhead. Ethan shut his eyes. His pulse climbed painfully beneath his ribs. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too dark, too loud. Then he heard soft movement behind him. Slow. Footsteps across timber floorboards. Ethan opened his eyes sharply. Rook stood only a meter away. Calm. Silent. Watching him carefully. The shepherd did not crowd closer. Did not whine. He simply remained there, body relaxed but attentive, as though recognizing something invisible happening beneath Ethan's skin. I am all right, Ethan muttered hoarsely. The lie sounded weak even to him. Another flash of lightning split across the lake outside. Ethan flinched instinctively. This time Rook stepped forward without hesitation. The shepherd pressed gently against Ethan's leg. Warm. Solid. Real. Ethan froze completely. For years no living thing had touched him during the worst moments. Not since Atlas. His throat tightened painfully. Rook leaned there quietly, offering nothing except steady presence. No demands. No fear. Just silent understanding from another creature that knew what storms could leave behind inside a soul. Ethan lowered one shaking hand slowly toward the shepherd's neck. Rook did not move away. Fingers disappeared into thick sable fur still carrying faint traces of rain and eucalyptus from outside. Warmth spread beneath Ethan's palm like something forgotten returning after years lost in darkness. The shepherd closed his eyes briefly at the touch. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Calloway did not feel entirely alone inside the storm. Rain continued through most of the night, rolling softly across the tin roof, while firelight flickered warm against the cabin walls. Ethan remained seated on the kitchen floor longer than he realized, one hand resting carefully against the thick fur along Rook's neck, while the shepherd leaned quietly beside him. Outside, thunder drifted farther toward the ranges, growing softer with each passing minute until only rain remained. Steady, gentle, like the world itself was finally exhaling after holding tension too long. Ethan's breathing slowly settled too. Not completely, but enough. He had forgotten what it felt like to come back from the edge of one of those nights without being entirely alone afterward. Rook eventually lowered himself beside the kitchen doorway, still close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from his body through the cool air. The shepherd did not demand attention after that. He simply stayed. Somewhere around midnight, the power returned with a faint hum through the lights overhead. Neither man nor dog reacted much. Ethan rubbed tired eyes and stood slowly, joints stiff from tension and exhaustion. Guess we both survived another storm, he muttered quietly. Rook lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice, ears twitching once before settling again. The simple familiarity of that reaction touched something deep beneath Ethan's guarded expression. He moved toward the hallway before pausing halfway there. The old instinct rose before he could stop it. He glanced back over his shoulder. You can sleep inside, you know. Rook remained still for a second as though uncertain he had heard correctly. Ethan sighed softly. Mate, I am too tired to repeat myself. The shepherd rose carefully and followed him down the hallway with quiet, measured steps. Ethan opened the spare room, first out of habit. Clean blankets folded neatly. Empty bed untouched for years. Yet Rook stopped near the doorway and refused to enter. Instead, he turned back toward Ethan's bedroom at the end of the hall. Ethan noticed immediately. Seriously? The shepherd sat calmly in the hallway without taking his eyes off him. Ethan stared for several long seconds before giving a tired shake of his head. You are stubborn. Rook's tail moved once softly against the timber floorboards. That tiny sound still felt miraculous somehow. Ethan left his bedroom door partly open that night. He had not done that since Atlas died. The old shepherd settled quietly just outside the doorway, head resting on crossed paws facing the hall as though standing watch over the entire cabin. Ethan noticed it before switching off the bedside lamp. Something tightened painfully in his chest again. Not grief this time. Something gentler. More dangerous. Trust. Sleep came slowly, but when it arrived, it carried fewer ghosts than usual. Dawn crept pale and silver through the bedroom curtains several hours later. Ethan woke instinctively at first light, like most former soldiers never stopped doing. For one disoriented moment, he lay still listening to unfamiliar breathing outside the doorway. Then memory returned softly. Rook. Ethan sat up carefully. The shepherd was still there exactly where he had fallen asleep. The one amber eye opened the moment Ethan moved beneath the blankets. Morning to you too, Ethan murmured, voice rough with sleep. Rook lifted his head immediately, but remained lying down until Ethan stepped into the hallway. Only then did the shepherd stand. The movement carried stiffness again. Ethan frowned slightly. Hip bothering you? Rook gave no sign except a faint hesitation near the back leg before following him toward the kitchen. Outside, morning mist drifted low across the lake, while sunlight slowly burned through the trees surrounding the cabin. The storm had washed the whole bushland clean overnight. Everything smelled fresh. Damp earth, eucalyptus, wood smoke lingering faintly from the fireplace. Ethan brewed coffee while Rook stood quietly near the back door watching birds hop across the veranda railing. You ever chase anything smaller than yourself? Ethan asked. The shepherd glanced back briefly, expression unreadable. Right? Thought so. A strange rhythm began settling over the morning after that. Quiet. Natural. Ethan cooked eggs and toast while Rook rested near the table. Later they walked slowly down toward the shoreline together beneath tall gums, swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan kept expecting the shepherd to wander off or keep distance, but Rook stayed near him every step of the way without needing commands. Not clinging, just close enough to say I am here. The lake shimmered silver beneath the rising sun, water barely rippling except where wind brushed the surface. Ethan stopped near the old wooden jetty extending crookedly over the reeds. Atlas used to leap from there into the water chasing sticks Ethan threw at sunrise. For years, Ethan had avoided coming down here for exactly that reason. Too many memories buried beneath the quiet beauty of the place. Rook stepped onto the jetty first, claws tapping softly against damp timber. He paused halfway down before looking back toward Ethan as though waiting. Ethan stared at him for a moment. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he followed. They stood there together in silence above the still water while magpies called somewhere beyond the trees. You know, Ethan said quietly after a while, I used to think loneliness got easier if you stayed in it long enough. Rook remained beside him facing the lake. Calm. Listening. Ethan gave a tired smile without humor. Turns out it just gets quieter. The shepherd shifted slightly closer until his shoulder rested gently against Ethan's leg. Not enough to trap him. Just enough to remind him another living thing existed beside him in the morning light. Ethan looked down slowly. Rook gazed back with the same steady amber eyes that had followed him since the shelter. No judgment. No expectation. Only presence. Wind moved softly through the reeds below the jetty. Somewhere overhead clouds drifted apart fully, revealing endless blue spreading wide across the Victorian sky. Ethan rested one hand carefully against the shepherd's neck again, fingers disappearing into thick sable fur warmed by sunlight. Rook closed his eyes briefly beneath the touch. And standing there above the quiet lake with morning stretching peacefully around them, Ethan felt something inside himself loosen for the very first time in years, like a locked room deep in his chest had finally opened its door a few centimeters to let light back in. By the third morning, the cabin no longer felt like a place holding its breath. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows in warm gold bands while wine stirred gently through the tall grass beyond the lake. Ethan stood barefoot near the stove cooking bacon in an old cast-iron pan, the scent filling the small cabin alongside fresh coffee and wood smoke lingering faintly from the fireplace. Behind him, Rook lay stretched near the back door where morning light touched the silver beginning to spread through his dark coat. The shepherd looked different already. Not fully healed. Not suddenly joyful, but softer somehow. less like a ghost waiting to disappear. Ethan glanced over his shoulder while flipping the bacon. You know this arrangement was supposed to last one day. Rook opened, one eye lazily at the sound of his voice. Ethan shook his head faintly. Yeah, that is what I thought too. The shepherd's tail tapped once against the timber floor. Slow, comfortable. Outside, magpies warbled from the fence posts while mist lifted gently off the lake in pale ribbons. Ethan carried his coffee onto the veranda afterward, and as usual, Rook followed without needing instruction. That still unsettled Ethan in quiet ways. The shepherd behaved less like a stray rescue and more like a dog who had spent years beside someone he trusted deeply before losing them. Every movement carried thought behind it. Discipline, patience, awareness. They sat together near the veranda steps while the bush slowly woke around them. Ethan noticed something else too. Rook no longer flinched whenever footsteps crossed nearby floorboards. No longer slept facing walls or corners. At night, he stayed near Ethan's bedroom door by choice, not fear. Healing did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it looked like a tired dog finally resting deeply enough to dream again. Later that morning, Ethan decided to drive into town for supplies. The fridge held little beyond eggs, milk, and leftover soup, and the cabin generator had begun making a grinding noise he did not trust. Usually these trips felt exhausting before they even started. Small talk, crowds, the ordinary noise of people living uncomplicated lives. But as Ethan grabbed his jacket near the front door, he noticed Rook standing quietly beside the Land Cruiser already waiting. You planning on coming too? The shepherd's ears lifted slightly. Ethan stared at him for a moment before sighing. Right then, the drive into Bendigo took nearly an hour along narrow country roads lined with gum trees silvered by morning light. Rook sat calmly in the passenger seat the entire way, one paw braced against the floor whenever the road curved sharply. Every now and then Ethan caught himself glancing sideways toward him. Atlas used to ride exactly the same way. Window cracked slightly, nose catching wind. Silent companionship filling spaces words never needed to touch. The memory no longer hollowed him out instantly now. That frightened Ethan, more than grief ever had. In town, the world felt louder than usual after days beside the quiet lake. Cafes spilling voices onto footpaths, trot eyes laughing near work trucks. Traffic lights changing beneath bright skies. Ethan kept his cap low while moving through the hardware shop collecting supplies. Rook stayed close beside him without needing a lead pulled tight once. Several people glanced toward the shepherd admiringly. One elderly man near the garden section smiled. Beautiful dog, mate. Ethan hesitated briefly before answering. Yeah. The word came easier than expected. Beautiful dog. Not rescue. Not temporary. Something inside Ethan shifted uneasily at how natural that sounded. Outside the grocery shop, a little girl around 6 years old stopped near the footpath clutching her mother's hand. Her eyes widened at the sight of Rook. Mom, look at the puppy. The mother laughed softly. That is a very big puppy. Ethan instinctively tensed, expecting the shepherd to retreat from strangers the way he once had at the shelter. Instead, Rook simply sat calmly beside Ethan's leg watching the child with gentle alertness. The little girl slowly held out one tiny hand. Can I say hello? Ethan looked down uncertainly. Rook remained completely still. Only gentle, all right. The child nodded seriously before touching the shepherd carefully near the shoulder. Rook did not move away. His amber eyes stayed soft and steady while the little girl smiled brightly enough to light the entire footpath. He looked sad, she whispered quietly. Ethan swallowed unexpectedly hard. Yeah, he murmured after a moment. Sometimes he is. The child looked up at Ethan with innocent certainty only children carried. He will feel better now. Her mother apologized politely before leading her away down the street, but Ethan remained standing there several seconds longer watching them disappear into the crowd. Beside him, Rook leaned very slightly against his leg, not seeking reassurance, offering it. The drive home passed beneath gathering afternoon clouds rolling slowly across the hills. Wind rattled dry leaves along the roadside, while sunlight flickered gold through moving branches. Overhead, halfway back to the cabin, Ethan stopped near an old petrol station outside Heathcote to fill the tank. As he stepped from the vehicle, a loud metallic clang sounded from somewhere behind the service shed where a loose gate slammed in the wind. Ethan flinched instinctively before he could stop himself. His breathing tightened sharply. Too fast. Too shallow. For one brief, terrible moment the world tilted backward into memory again. Dust. Alarms. Fear buried deep beneath instinct. Then warmth pressed suddenly against his side. Rook stood there beside him, calm and solid, amber eyes fixed entirely on Ethan instead of the noise around them. The shepherd's posture never changed. Steady. Grounded. Here. Ethan lowered one hand slowly into the fur along Rook's neck while forcing air back into his lungs. The panic eased faster this time. Much faster. An older man pumping diesel nearby glanced toward them quietly before nodding once with gentle understanding. Looks after you, does he? Ethan stared down at the shepherd for several long seconds. Yeah, he answered softly. I reckon he does. Rain began falling lightly again by the time they reached the cabin near dusk. Ethan unloaded groceries while Rook waited patiently beneath the veranda roof, watching the gray water ripple across the lake. Somewhere beyond the reeds, thunder murmured faintly in the distance. Another storm moving in. But this time, as Ethan carried supplies inside and glanced back toward the shepherd standing faithfully in the rain-dimmed evening light, the cabin no longer felt haunted by silence. It felt occupied, guarded, like two wounded souls had somehow begun building something fragile and sacred together without either one fully noticing the moment it started. The storm arrived fully after dark, slow rolling clouds swallowing the stars above the lake until the whole bushland seemed wrapped inside deep silver shadow. Rain tapped steadily against the veranda roof while wind moved through the gums with a low whispering sound that reminded Ethan of distant surf. Inside the cabin, warm firelight flickered across timber walls and old photographs, while Rook rested near the hearth, eyes half closed but ears always alert to every shift and sound around him. Ethan sat at the kitchen table repairing an old battery radio more out of habit than necessity. The world had narrowed pleasantly these past few days. Morning walks beside the lake, quiet meals, shared silence. It felt dangerous how quickly routine had begun settling around another living creature again. Dangerous because Ethan had learned long ago that peace rarely stayed where he loved something too deeply. The radio crackled suddenly beneath his hands before falling silent again. Ethan muttered under his breath and reached for a screwdriver. Across the room, Rook lifted his head immediately at the frustration in Ethan's voice. It is dead, mate, Ethan sighed. Like half the things in this cabin. The shepherd watched him quietly for a few seconds before lowering his muzzle back onto his paws. Outside, lightning flickered faintly beyond the hills. Another storm drifting closer. Ethan noticed Rook's ears twitch at the distant thunder, though the shepherd stayed calm beside the fire. You are handling storms better than me now, Ethan murmured. The strange truth of that lingered heavily in the room afterward. Around 9 o'clock the rain intensified, hammering the tin roof hard enough to shake droplets loose from the veranda gutters. Ethan stood near the kitchen sink watching darkness ripple across the lake outside the window. Lightning flashed again farther off, briefly illuminating the reeds and leaning jetty in pale white light. Then something moved near the shoreline. Ethan frowned slightly. A figure. Small. Low to the ground. He narrowed his eyes toward the storm outside. Another flash revealed it more clearly. A kangaroo joey standing trapped waist-deep near the muddy edge of the flooded reeds, trembling beneath the rain. Ethan swore softly under his breath. The recent storms must have flooded the lower bank. The frightened joey shifted again, trying unsuccessfully to climb free from the slick mud pulling at its legs. Before Ethan could even reach for his jacket, Rook was already standing beside the back door. Alert. Focused. Waiting. Ethan glanced at him. You saw it too? The shepherd's gaze never left the shoreline. Another frightened movement came from outside. Ethan grabbed a raincoat and torch quickly. All right. Come on then. Cold rain hit immediately the moment they stepped off the veranda. Wind whipped through the trees while mud sucked at Ethan's boots as he moved carefully toward the flooded bank. The torch beam cut through sheets of rain, finally landing on the joey struggling weakly near the reeds. Tiny thing, barely bigger than a kelpie pup. Exhausted and terrified, Ethan crouched carefully several meters away so he would not frighten it further. Easy there, little mate. The joey panicked slightly at his voice, slipping deeper into the mud with a frightened kick. Instantly Rook moved forward. Calm. Controlled. Ethan froze, watching carefully. The shepherd did not rush the joey or bark. He simply lowered himself slowly onto the wet ground nearby, body relaxed, ears soft, amber eyes steady despite the rain pouring down his fur. The joey stopped struggling almost immediately. Ethan stared in quiet disbelief. "You clever old bloke," he whispered. Rook remained perfectly still while the tiny animal slowly settled enough for Ethan to step closer and ease it free from the mud. The joey trembled violently inside Ethan's jacket once he lifted it clear of the flooded reeds. Thin heartbeat fluttering fast beneath soaked fur. "You are all right now," Ethan murmured gently. Rain streamed down his face while thunder rolled somewhere across the hills again. Beside him, Rook rose slowly and nudged Ethan's elbow once as if checking both human and joey together. Ethan laughed softly despite the storm. "You running rescue operations now too?" The shepherd blinked rainwater from his eyes and stayed close beside Ethan all the way back toward the cabin. Inside, warmth returned slowly. Ethan wrapped the joey carefully in old towels near the fireplace, while Rook lay nearby, watching over the tiny creature with calm attention. The joey eventually stopped trembling enough to fall asleep, curled beside the hearth. Ethan sat back heavily in his chair, staring at both animals in the firelight. "You know," he said quietly to Rook, "most people spend years trying to become good again after hard things happen to them." The shepherd looked toward him. Firelight shimmered softly in his amber eyes. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. "You just stayed good anyway." Outside, rain softened gradually into a gentle, steady drizzle against the roof. Inside, the cabin glowed warm and alive in ways it had not for years. One wounded man, one old shepherd, one tiny rescued joey asleep by the fire. Simple things, quiet things. Yet somewhere deep inside Ethan, another locked door opened slightly wider. Much later that night, after the joey had been settled safely into a cardboard box lined with blankets near the heater, Ethan stood alone near the window looking out across the dark lake. Reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Behind him, Rook rested calmly beside the fireplace. Home. The word slipped unexpectedly into Ethan's thoughts before he could stop it. Not the cabin. Not the lake. The feeling. He had almost forgotten what it felt like when silence stopped meaning emptiness. Then soft movement crossed the floorboards behind him. Ethan turned just as Rook approached, slowly carrying something carefully between his teeth. An old leather collar. Ethan's breath caught instantly. Atlas's collar. The shepherd laid it gently at Ethan's feet before sitting quietly beside him beneath the soft firelight. Ethan stared down at the worn leather for several long seconds without moving. Then very slowly, he knelt beside the old shepherd, one trembling hand resting against thick sable fur, while tears he had buried for years finally slipped free in complete silence. And Rook stayed there beside him through every second of it. Morning arrived softly after the storm, pale sunlight spilling across the lake in shimmering silver ribbons, while mist drifted low through the reeds near the shoreline. The cabin smelled faintly of damp timber, coffee, and wet fur drying beside the fireplace. Ethan stood quietly at the kitchen bench, staring down at Atlas's old collar resting near his hands. The leather looked smaller somehow in daylight, worn smooth from years of use. Time had faded the stitching almost white along the edges. He traced one thumb slowly across the brass buckle while memories moved gently through him now instead of crashing like waves. Behind him, Rook rested near the hearth where the rescued joey still slept curled inside the towel-lined box beside the heater. The shepherd watched Ethan carefully, but without pressure. Just there. Always there. Ethan swallowed once before speaking quietly into the stillness. "You knew where I kept it." Rook's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Ethan looked toward him slowly. "How?" The shepherd lowered his head back onto his paws without answering, of course, but something about the gesture felt almost understanding rather than avoidance. Ethan gave a soft breath of amusement through his nose. "Right. Keep your secrets then." Outside, birdsong echoed gently through the gum trees while morning light warmed the veranda boards. It should have felt like any ordinary day beside the lake. Yet something subtle had changed overnight. The grief Ethan carried no longer sat inside the cabin like an unwelcome ghost. Atlas still mattered. Always would. But for the first time in years, remembering him had not left Ethan hollow afterward. It had left him grateful. The Joey woke shortly after sunrise and drank water carefully from a shallow bowl, while Rook watched nearby with calm, patient eyes. Ethan crouched beside the little animal, checking its leg gently. "Looks like you got lucky, little mate." The Joey blinked sleepily up at him. Behind Ethan, Rook shifted closer and sniffed the tiny creature once before sitting back again. Gentle. Controlled. Ethan shook his head softly. "You really are something else." By mid-morning, the clouds had fully cleared, revealing endless blue stretched above the Victorian bushland. Ethan decided the Joey needed returning closer to the wildlife carers outside town. He loaded a small crate carefully into the Land Cruiser, while Rook waited nearby beneath the veranda. "You coming?" Ethan asked automatically. The shepherd stood immediately. Ethan smiled faintly before he could stop himself. "Thought so." The drive south felt strangely peaceful beneath bright sunlight and open country skies. Kangaroos moved through distant paddocks. Beyond fences silvered by morning dew, while wind carried the scent of eucalyptus through the cracked windows. The Joey slept quietly in the back seat most of the way. Rook rode beside Ethan again, calm and alert, one ear twitching whenever tires crunched over gravel bends in the road. Somewhere outside Heathcote, Ethan found himself talking aloud more than he had in months. Small things mostly. Weather. The engine noise. Old stories slipping free without intention. Atlas hated long drives, he said quietly while turning onto a narrow dirt road. Used to whinge every 20 minutes until I stopped for him. Rook glanced sideways at him briefly before returning his gaze to the road ahead. Ethan shook his head with soft amusement. "Yeah, all right. You are tougher than he was." The wildlife sanctuary sat on the edge of a broad reserve lined with ironbark trees and dusty walking tracks winding toward the hills. A woman in her 60s greeted Ethan warmly near the gate, silver hair tucked beneath a faded Akubra hat. "Poor little thing," she murmured while lifting the Joey carefully from the crate. "Storms scatter them everywhere this time of year." Then she noticed Rook standing quietly beside Ethan's leg. "Beautiful shepherd." Ethan rested one hand absent-mindedly against the dog's neck. "Yeah." The woman smiled knowingly at the way Rook leaned subtly into the touch. "Looks attached to you already." Ethan opened his mouth to deny it before stopping himself. Because the truth sat plainly between them now. Rook was attached, and so was he. The realization settled heavily inside his chest as the woman carried the Joey safely toward the sanctuary buildings. Ethan stood watching for a long moment while warm winds stirred dust along the track. "I did not mean for this to happen, mate," he admitted quietly. Beside him, Rook remained calm as always. The shepherd simply looked up at Ethan with steady amber eyes full of that same impossible patience. On the drive home, clouds began gathering again across the western horizon, though no rain followed this time. Just shifting shadows rolling across golden paddocks beneath the afternoon sun. Ethan stopped once along the lake road, near a quiet lookout overlooking the valley below. He climbed out slowly and rested against the bonnet while wind moved cool across the hills. Rook stepped beside him moments later. Together they stared out over endless bushland stretching blue-green beneath the sky. Ethan folded his arms across his chest. "You know what scares me?" he asked softly after a while. Rook glanced toward him. Ethan gave a tired smile that never fully reached his eyes. "Losing things again." Wind rustled through dry grass around them. That is the problem with caring about something. Eventually life asks for it back. The shepherd stepped closer until his shoulder rested quietly against Ethan's leg once more. No dramatic gesture, just warmth. Presence. "Here." Ethan looked down slowly. The old ache inside him stirred again, but differently now. Not fear exactly. More like the painful understanding that love always carried risk because it mattered enough to wound when gone. He closed his eyes briefly beneath the afternoon breeze. "You already know that too, do you not?" Rook blinked calmly up at him. And for one strange, suspended moment beneath the wide Australian sky, Ethan realized neither of them had survived by becoming fearless. They survived because somewhere deep beneath grief and loneliness, they still carried the courage to stay gentle anyway. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees near dusk, warm orange sunlight had begun spilling low across the lake. Ethan parked slowly near the veranda while Rook climbed down beside him onto the gravel drive. The shepherd paused there looking toward the house before glancing back at Ethan as though waiting once more for silent permission to enter the life standing open before him. This time Ethan did not hesitate. He rested one hand against the old dog's shoulder and nodded softly toward the glowing cabin windows ahead. "Come home, mate." The days that followed settled into a rhythm so gentle Ethan almost distrusted it. Morning mist over the lake. Coffee steaming beside the veranda rails. Rooks stretched beneath the pale sunrise while magpies warbled through the gums like old souls greeting the dawn. Small things. Ordinary things. Yet after years spent drifting through silence like a man surviving instead of living, the simplicity felt almost sacred. Ethan repaired the broken fence near the western paddock one cool morning while Rook followed close beside him through knee-high grass silvered with dew. The shepherd moved slower than younger dogs would have, but there was quiet strength in him still. Purpose. Whenever Ethan knelt near the old timber posts, Rook settled nearby watching the tree line with calm alertness like a soldier who had never fully retired from duty. Around midday Ethan straightened slowly, pressing a hand against his lower back with a tired groan. "Getting old, mate." Rook glanced toward him with ears twitching once. Ethan smirked faintly. "Do not look smug. You creak worse than I do." The shepherd's tail brushed softly through the grass. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. The sound surprised him enough that he stopped working for a second afterward. Real laughter. Not forced politeness. Not hollow amusement. Something genuine. Wind drifted cool across the paddock, carrying the smell of eucalyptus and dry earth warming beneath spring sun. Rook remained beside him the whole afternoon, not demanding attention, just there in the steady, dependable way that had slowly become part of Ethan's days, without permission ever being spoken aloud. That evening clouds rolled low across the lake again, though no storm followed this time. Just soft gray skies and distant thunder fading somewhere beyond the hills. Ethan cooked stew on the old stove while Rook rested near the fireplace. Halfway through chopping carrots, Ethan noticed the shepherd staring toward the front window. Not alarmed. Focused. Ethan frowned slightly. "What is it?" Rook stood slowly and moved toward the door. A moment later tires crunched softly along the gravel driveway outside. Ethan stiffened instinctively before looking through the window. A familiar white shelter Uda pulled into view beneath the gums. The young kennel worker stepped out holding a folder beneath one arm. Rook remained still near the doorway, watching carefully but without fear. Ethan opened the door before the man reached the veranda. "Everything all right?" The worker smiled warmly. "Yeah, mate. Sorry to drop by unannounced." He glanced down toward Rook. "Actually came to check on him." Ethan looked at the shepherd standing quietly beside his leg. "Seems all right to me." "Looks more than all right." The worker stepped onto the veranda shaking rain from his jacket. "Honestly, we barely recognized him in the photos you sent." Ethan hesitated. He had forgotten about the picture he texted 2 days earlier after the Joey rescue. Rook lying peacefully beside the lake beneath morning sunlight. The first photograph Ethan had taken of another living thing in years. "Can I come in?" the worker asked gently. Inside, warmth from the stove wrapped softly around the cabin while rain tapped lightly against the roof again. The worker crouched carefully near Rook, allowing the shepherd to approach first. Rook sniffed his hand once before settling calmly back near Ethan. "That right there," the worker said quietly, "would have been impossible 2 weeks ago." Ethan leaned against the kitchen bench folding his arms. What happened to him before the shelter? The question lingered heavily in the room. The worker exhaled slowly before opening the folder he carried. "We finally matched the damaged chip fragments to old records." Ethan's chest tightened slightly without understanding why. The worker pulled out an old printed photograph softened at the edges by age and handling. A different man stood smiling beside Rook in the picture. Mid-50s. Weathered a Kubra hat. Kind eyes. The shepherd looked younger there. Coat darker, posture proud and alert. Ethan stared quietly. His name was not always Rook, the worker said softly. Original records say Bishop. Ethan looked down toward the shepherd instantly. At the sound of the name, one ear twitched faintly. The worker nodded slowly. Yeah, he remembers it. Rain whispered against the windows while firelight flickered across the old photograph between them. The man in the picture was named Walter Green. The worker continued. Former paramedic. Worked bush rescue around Castlemaine for years. Apparently Bishop was trained as a trauma support dog after Walter's wife passed away. Ethan listened silently while Rook remained beside his chair calm and still. Locals said those two were inseparable, the worker said. Walter started visiting veterans' hospitals with him too. Retirement homes, recovery centers, anywhere lonely people needed company. Ethan swallowed hard without knowing why. What happened? The worker's expression softened sadly. Walter died last winter. Silence settled instantly over the cabin. Outside, wind stirred rain softly through the trees. Families sold the property afterward. The worker continued carefully. Bishop ended up bounced between relatives for a bit. Then somebody dropped him at the shelter after he stopped responding properly. Ethan stared down at the shepherd near his feet. Suddenly everything made terrible sense. The silence. The waiting by doors. The way Rook looked at people like he had already learned what leaving felt like. He was grieving. Ethan murmured quietly. Still is, the worker said gently. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the fireplace. Across from him, Rook lifted calm amber eyes filled with old sorrow carried patiently for too long. Ethan understood that look better than anyone alive probably could. The worker closed the folder softly. Thing is, he added after a moment, dogs like him usually do not come back from shutting down that deeply. He glanced around the cabin quietly, but somehow he did hear. Ethan looked toward the lake beyond the rain-streaked windows. Firelight danced softly across the room while the old shepherd rested beside him close enough that warmth touched his boots. Maybe, Ethan said after a long silence, he just needed someone else who understood what it felt like to lose home. Rook shifted then, slowly resting his heavy head against Ethan's knee for the very first time. No hesitation, no fear, just trust offered completely at last. Ethan's breath caught softly in his chest, and as rain whispered gently over the roof above them, he rested one hand against the old shepherd's silvered fur and realized neither of them had rescued the other alone. Rain lingered softly through the night after the shelter worker left, tapping gently against the cabin roof while wind carried the scent of wet eucalyptus through the cracked kitchen window. Ethan remained seated near the fireplace long after the Uda headlights disappeared down the dirt track. The old photograph of Walter Green rested in his hands while Rook slept beside the chair with his head still leaning lightly against Ethan's knee. Bishop. The name echoed quietly through Ethan's thoughts now. Somehow knowing the shepherd had once belonged so completely to someone else made the bond between them feel heavier and more sacred at the same time. Not replacement. Never replacement. Two grieving souls simply finding shelter beside each other in the dark. Ethan looked down toward the sleeping shepherd, studying the silver woven through his muzzle and the small twitch of his ears while dreaming. You waited for him too, he murmured softly. Rook did not wake, but his breathing deepened slightly beneath Ethan's hand resting against his neck. Outside, thunder rolled faintly far beyond the hills. The storm was already moving away. Morning arrived cold and blue-gray. Mist floated thick across the lake while frost silvered the grass surrounding the cabin. Ethan woke early as usual, though this time the heaviness in his chest felt quieter somehow. Not gone, just gentler around the edges. He found Rook already awake near the back door watching dawn unfold across the water. Could not sleep either? Ethan asked quietly while pulling on a jumper. The shepherd glanced back briefly. Ethan brewed coffee and stood beside the window warming his hands against the mug while pale sunlight slowly pushed through the mist outside. The old cabin creaked softly around them like something ancient stretching awake. Rook eventually wandered toward the fireplace where Walter's photograph still rested on the table from the night before. Ethan noticed the shepherd pause there. Calm, thoughtful almost. You miss him every day, do you not? Rook lowered himself carefully onto the rug beside the photograph. Ethan swallowed against the ache rising unexpectedly in his throat. Yeah, he whispered after a moment. Me too. Later that morning, Ethan drove into town alone for the first time since bringing Rook home. The shepherd watched quietly from the veranda while Ethan grabbed his keys near the front door. Something about leaving unsettled Ethan more than it should have. I will not be long, he muttered awkwardly. Rook remained sitting near the steps, amber eyes following him all the way down the driveway until the Land Cruiser disappeared beyond the trees. Bendigo bustled beneath bright winter sun by the time Ethan reached town. Cafes crowded with weekend voices. Market stalls lining the footpaths. Country music drifting faintly from somewhere near the bakery. Yet even surrounded by people again, Ethan felt strangely aware of absence beside him now. Every few minutes his eyes drifted instinctively toward the empty passenger seat. At the hardware shop checkout, the elderly cashier smiled politely while scanning supplies. "Your dog not with you today?" Ethan blinked in surprise. "Sorry, the shepherd. Saw him with you last week." She smiled warmly. "Beautiful animal." Ethan looked down briefly at the counter. "He is at home." The word left his mouth naturally before he fully realized it. Home, not the cabin. The dog. Ethan drove back faster than intended afterward, gravel crunching sharply beneath the tires as he pulled into the driveway near midday. Rook stood the moment the vehicle appeared through the gums. Ethan had barely opened the door before the shepherd crossed the yard toward him. Calm but purposeful, like a soul finally learning someone might actually return. Ethan crouched instinctively before he even thought about it. All right, he murmured softly as Rook pressed close enough for warm fur to brush his jacket. "I came back." The shepherd rested his head briefly against Ethan's shoulder. Simple, trusting. Ethan closed his eyes for one quiet second beneath the pale winter sunlight. Later that afternoon, they walked together along the edge of the lake while cold wind rippled the water silver beneath gathering clouds. Rook moved slower today. Ethan noticed it immediately. A slight stiffness through the hips. Careful steps along uneven ground. Age catching quietly where strength once carried him effortlessly. Concern settled low in Ethan's chest. "You hiding sore joints from me now?" Rook kept walking calmly beside him. Ethan sighed softly. "Yeah, thought so." They stopped near the old jetty where reeds swayed gently in the breeze. Ethan rested against one weathered post staring out across the water while Rook settled beside him facing the horizon. Silence wrapped around them comfortably now. Not lonely silence. Shared silence. Healing silence. "I never told anyone what happened with Atlas," Ethan admitted quietly after a while. Wind stirred through the reeds below. After deployment ended, people asked if I was all right all the time. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Funny thing is, nobody really wanted the truth." Rook remained still beside him, listening the way only dogs could. Completely. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. "He saved my life during an operation overseas. Twice, actually." His voice roughened slightly. Then one day he was just gone. The lake shimmered pale beneath drifting clouds, while distant cockatoos wheeled through the sky above the trees. Ethan stared downward at his hands. "After that I stopped sleeping properly. Stopped talking much. Felt easier not to care about anything than risk losing it again." Beside him, Rook slowly rested his muzzle against Ethan's knee. Ethan's eyes closed briefly at the touch. "Warm. Steady. Here. Then you walked into my life looking just as lost as I was." Wind brushed softly through the shepherd's silvered fur. Ethan let out a long breath toward the lake. "Maybe Walter was right about you." Rook glanced up slowly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe some souls are sent to find people before they disappear completely." The sun dipped lower behind the hills as they finally turned back toward the cabin together. Long shadows stretched across the paddocks while smoke curled faintly from nearby chimneys in the distance. Ethan walked slower than usual so the old shepherd could keep pace beside him. No hurry anymore. Somewhere along the shoreline, without either one fully noticing the exact moment it happened, grief had stopped being the only thing connecting them. Trust had taken root there too. And under the cold Australian sky with evening gathering gently around them, Ethan realized he no longer feared loving the old dog despite the risk waiting someday at the end of every living thing. Because some bonds were worth the heartbreak simply for the grace of having existed at all. Winter settled deeper across the lake country over the following weeks, painting the mornings pale with frost and wrapping the bushland in soft silver mist before sunrise. The cabin changed with the season too. Firewood stacked higher beside the hearth. Thick blankets folded across the old couch. The scent of cedar smoke lingering warmly through every room long after dark. And always, somewhere nearby, the quiet, steady presence of the old shepherd who no longer waited by doors as though expecting abandonment. Rook had begun sleeping fully inside Ethan's room now, curled near the fireplace on cold nights with one ear always tuned toward the sound of Ethan breathing. Some habits of protection never faded completely. One early morning, Ethan woke before dawn to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the roof. For a few seconds, he remained still beneath the blankets, listening to the peaceful rhythm filling the cabin. Then he noticed something unusual. Silence from Rook. Ethan sat up slowly. The shepherd remained lying near the hearth where the embers glowed faint orange in the darkness. But he had not lifted his head at Ethan's movement the way he always did. Concern tightened instantly beneath Ethan's ribs. Rook. The shepherd's eyes opened slowly at the sound of his name, though rising seemed to take visible effort this morning. Ethan crossed the room, immediately kneeling beside him. Hey, mate. One careful hand moved across the old dog's shoulders. Warm. No fever. But tired. Very tired. Rook finally pushed himself upright with quiet determination, though stiffness pulled heavily through his back legs. Ethan frowned deeply. You should have told me sooner. The shepherd blinked slowly as if apologizing for becoming old. Rain whispered softly outside while pale dawn light slowly crept through the curtains. Ethan remained crouched there longer than necessary, fingers buried gently in sable fur, silvered more heavily now around the muzzle and eyes. The truth sat quietly between them. Time was moving. Later that morning, Ethan drove them into Bendigo to visit the local vet clinic near the edge of town. Cold winds swept leaves along the footpaths while gray clouds drifted low overhead. Rook sat calmly beside Ethan in the waiting room despite several barking dogs nearby. A young border collie strained excitedly against its lead across the room, yet Rook simply rested his head against Ethan's knee with tired patience. The receptionist smiled softly while typing notes into the computer. He is beautiful. Ethan looked down at the shepherd beside him. Yeah, he answered quietly. He really is. Dr. Claire Henderson moved gently during the examination, experienced hands careful around the old shepherd's hips and joints. Rook tolerated everything without complaint, though Ethan noticed the faint tightening around his eyes whenever certain movements caused discomfort. Afterward, the vet sat beside the desk quietly reviewing scans while rain streaked softly down the clinic windows behind her. There is arthritis through the hips and spine, she said gently. Pretty advanced. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Pain. Some. She glanced toward Rook lying calmly near the chair. But dogs like him are remarkable at carrying discomfort quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. Of course he was. The old shepherd had carried grief quietly too. Medication will help, Dr. Henderson continued. Warm bedding. Less strain on the joints. Mostly, she smiled softly toward Rook. Mostly he just needs peace. Ethan looked down at the shepherd resting against his boots. He has got that. The drive home felt quieter than usual. Rain drifted across the windscreen in soft silver streaks, while cold fog rolled through the valleys beyond the road. Rook slept most of the way with his muzzle resting near Ethan's arm. Every now and then Ethan glanced sideways just to reassure himself the old shepherd was still there breathing steadily beside him. Fear moved differently now than it once had. Before Rook, Ethan feared attachment itself. Now he feared losing it. Back at the cabin, Ethan spread extra blankets near the fireplace and adjusted furniture, so Rook no longer needed to climb stairs unnecessarily. The shepherd watched all this quietly from the rug, while evening settled blue-gray across the lake outside. Do not look at me like that, Ethan muttered while carrying another blanket into the lounge. You would do the same for me. Rook's tail brushed softly once against the floorboards. That night the rain finally stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean and still beneath the moonlight. Ethan sat on the veranda wrapped in an old wool jumper while Rook rested beside his chair facing the dark shimmering water. Frost glittered faintly across the grass near the reeds. You know, Ethan said quietly after a long silence, I used to think strength meant surviving things alone. Wind moved gently through the gums overhead. Turns out that is just another way of disappearing. Beside him, Rook shifted closer until warm fur pressed lightly against Ethan's leg through the cold night air. Ethan rested one hand slowly against the shepherd's silvered head. Walter was lucky to have you. The old dog closed his eyes beneath the touch. Ethan stared out across the still black lake while stars reflected softly in the water below. So was I. Somewhere deep inside him, grief stirred again at the edges. Not sharp anymore. Not drowning. Just honest. Loving something always meant accepting its fragility. Yet for the first time in years, Ethan no longer wished to protect himself from that truth by hiding from connection. Because this old shepherd had walked quietly into the ruins of his life and taught him something no therapist or metal or lonely silence ever could. Healing was not forgetting pain. Healing was learning there could still be warmth beside it. Much later, long after the fire burned low and the cabin settled into midnight stillness, Ethan woke briefly to soft movement near the bed. Rook had climbed stiffly to his feet and wandered toward the window overlooking the lake. Moonlight silvered his old coat while he stood there watching the sleeping world outside. Ethan pushed himself upright slowly. "What is it, mate?" Rook glanced back over his shoulder. Amber eyes calm and impossibly gentle beneath the pale moonlight. Then slowly, carefully, he crossed back toward the bed and rested his head against Ethan's hand. Ethan's fingers curled instinctively into the warm fur around his neck. Neither moved for a long while after that. Outside, winter wrapped the quiet Australian bushland in silver and silence. Inside the cabin beside the lake, one lonely man and one aging shepherd remained together beneath the same roof, holding on to the fragile, beautiful grace of having found each other before it was too late. Spring arrived quietly beside the lake. Frost melted earlier each morning, sunlight warmed the reeds, and wildflowers bloomed beneath the gums. The old cabin looked brighter too. Curtains opened wider. Laughter lived there now in small moments that once would have felt impossible. Ethan stood on the veranda one golden morning while Rook rested nearby in the sun. The shepherd moved slower these days, careful when standing, careful on stairs. But his eyes no longer carried the emptiness from the shelter corner where Ethan first found him. They carried peace now, deep and quiet. A battered green sign leaned against the fence near the driveway. Ethan had spent 3 evenings repainting it himself. The words across the timber read simply, "Atlas and Bishop Recovery Retreat." Small lettering underneath followed. "A quiet place for veterans. You reckon Walter would approve?" Ethan asked softly. Rook's tail brushed once through the grass. "Yeah," Ethan smiled. "I think so too." It had started accidentally. A former soldier from Melbourne contacted Ethan after hearing he sometimes let struggling veterans stay a few nights by the lake. Then another arrived. Then another. Men and women carrying sleepless eyes, heavy silences, and invisible wounds they struggled explaining to the rest of the world. Somehow the cabin became a place where people breathed easier. Maybe because the lake stayed quiet. Maybe because Ethan understood. Or maybe because an old German shepherd always knew when somebody needed silent company. Rook became the heart of the place without trying. A young woman cried beside the jetty until Rook rested his head against her shoulder and stayed there until her breathing steadied. An older medic sat by the fireplace with the shepherd asleep against his boots and whispered, "I forgot what calm felt like." Ethan heard those moments. Each time, something inside him healed too. One warm afternoon in October, Ethan repaired fishing nets on the veranda while several veterans drank tea nearby. Rook slept beneath the old wooden table, muzzle almost completely silver now, one ear no longer standing properly. A younger veteran named Callum glanced down at him. Hard to believe he was abandoned. Ethan looked toward Rook. Some souls just get lost before the right person finds them. Callum nodded. "Feels like he found you too." "Yeah," Ethan murmured. He did. That evening, after everyone else had gone inside, a sharp crack split the quiet from across the valley. A bird scarer in a distant paddock. To most people it was nothing. To Callum, standing alone at the end of the jetty, it was a door blown open inside his head. Ethan heard the mug hit the boards first. Then he saw Callum stagger, one hand gripping his chest, eyes fixed on a place that was not the lake anymore. "Callum," Ethan called, already moving. "Look at me, mate." But Callum could not hear him. His knees buckled. For one terrible second he swayed toward the edge, and the dark water waited below. Rook moved before Ethan could. The old shepherd rose with a force Ethan had not seen in months. Pain flashed through his hips, but he crossed the grass, reached the jetty, and pressed his aging body against Callum's legs. Solid enough to stop the fall, gentle enough not to frighten him. Callum froze. "That's it," Ethan said softly as he reached them. "Feel him. Feel where you are." Callum's hand dropped into Rook's fur. His breathing broke once, then steadied by a fraction. Rook stayed standing though his back legs trembled. The old dog kept his amber eyes on Callum with the same calm devotion that had brought Ethan back from storms. Minutes passed before Callum sank to his knees and wrapped both arms around the shepherd's neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. Rook only lowered his head against the young man's shoulder. Ethan knelt beside them, chest tight with fear. For a moment, he thought Rook might collapse there in front of them. But the shepherd simply held on until Callum could breathe again. Later, after everyone had gone quiet and the first stars appeared above the lake, Ethan carried an extra blanket down to the jetty. Rook lay beside him, exhausted but peaceful, his silver muzzle resting across Ethan's knee. The retreat lights glowed warmly behind them. Voices murmured inside the cabin. Not lonely voices, living voices. Ethan rested a hand against the old dog's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath silvered fur. Slower now. Older. Precious. You know what you gave me, mate? He whispered. Rook turned his head slightly toward him. You gave me back the part of myself that still believed staying alive should mean something. Behind them, Callum laughed softly. Small and fragile, but real. Ethan closed his eyes. That laugh proved pain did not get the final word. Home. Real home. Not built from timber or roofs or old memories. Built from presence. Trust. Grace shared quietly between wounded souls who chose not to leave each other behind. Rook rested his heavy head across Ethan's knee like he had done 100 times before. Ethan smiled through tears that no longer came from grief alone. Remember the shelter? He whispered. You sitting there in that dark corner pretending you did not need anyone. The shepherd blinked slowly toward him. Ethan let out a trembling breath. Funny thing is, I thought the same about myself. Above them, stars shimmered across the endless Australian sky. Behind them, the windows of Atlas and Bishop Recovery Retreat glowed like lanterns left burning for anyone still trying to find the way back. Ethan bent close and pressed his forehead gently to Rook's silvered head. You are not the dog in the corner anymore, he whispered. You are the reason the lights stay on. And in the peaceful silence beside the lake, Ethan finally understood the truth Rook had carried all along. Healing does not always arrive as rescue. Sometimes it arrives as a tired dog who refuses to let you fall. Sometimes it stays beside you in the dark until you remember you were never meant to carry the world alone.